actually dig into the topic of the day. And that is actually a panel discussion about when it makes sense to use content fragments and experience fragments. So why this topic? I think it's a very popular topic in the AEM world because content fragments and experience fragments are heavily used in AEM and also heavily misused. So I've personally seen it misused on a lot of projects that I worked on, and the mistakes that you can make early when making design decisions, they create a lot of maintenance problems later. So the point of this discussion today will be to discuss like those use cases when it makes sense to use one or the other, and to have our fellow champions share some of their experience when it makes sense to use one versus the other, hopefully to give you some guidance for your future projects and implementations, or maybe even re-implementations of existing projects. So please join us in the discussion, ask the questions in the QA. And we will, of course, try to answer all of your questions either live or in the chat. All right, so we have three champions today. Myself, I will be hosting this event. My name is Daniel. I'm located in Croatia, and I'm a founder of a small agency and AEM Champion. Been working with AEM for more than 10 years now, mostly for enterprise clients in Europe. And I have two colleagues with me. Greg, if you can please introduce yourself and then hand over to Esteban.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Daniel. Hey, everyone. I'm joining you from the Washington, D.C. area. Well, actually, today I'm in Inner Harbor, Baltimore. But I'm Greg Dimaris. I'm original AEM champion for 4 years, 5 years now. Um, I work with a team of developers, architects, and content authors in my organization in the content supply chain area, and I'm excited to talk to you about the bread and butter of AEM, content fragments and experience fragments today. And I'll pass it on to Esteban.
Thank you, Greg. Well, I'm Esteban. I'm based on Eurowise. Right now, I'm recording from Ecuador. I'm just in PTO. It's always fun to discuss about AEM stuff. I work as a technical architect at Ocean right now. I've been working with AEM for about uh, 12 and plus years. I have several certifications, like 9 plus. Just collect them as cards, I guess. And yeah, my area of expertise is AEM sites. Besides that, I work with Target and other Adobe products. So yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks, guys. Happy to have you here. And yeah, I guess we can kick it off with a little bit of introduction. So I assume most of you in the call might be familiar with what are content fragments, what are experience fragments, but maybe for some that aren't so familiar with it, we wanted to set the stage a little bit and share a couple of examples before we get started with the panel session. So basically, we have, besides sites in AEM sites, we have two types of fragments, and ones are called content fragments, and the other ones are called experience fragments. And it will be quite confusing if you haven't used them before to know like what is the difference and when to use which. So I'll try to briefly explain. First of all, content fragments. Basically, content fragments are you can imagine it as just like a form to store data with a presentation agnostic content. So you have some data that you want to reuse, for example, for different channels or for headless delivery. You don't want to associate presentation with the data because you know that data is supposed to be reused in multiple places. Then what you can do in AEM is create a model. And what is a model? It's basically just a definition of fields that you want for that specific data type. So you define if you want specific text fields or select boxes or rich texts or even connections to other content fragments, relationships. And then when you have a model, your editors can use that model to create reusable content. And when I say reusable, I mean content fragments can be reused across pages, but not only pages. So you can use it for different channels, for example, as well. If you have, for example, a mobile application, you can deliver very simply with no development those content fragments to the mobile app, either via REST or GraphQL APIs. So really, like they make sense for omnichannel and headless delivery. On the other side, we have experience fragments, which like the main difference between them is that experience fragments combine both content and layout, which means they are tied to a design. You can have different variations, yes, but they are still tied together with the design. So you actually build experience fragments from the components you have in AEM, and those components, of course, include the design. Why would you want to combine content and layout and not always use content fragments? Is because sometimes like it makes more sense to ensure brand consistency, or a section of a page that you really want to reuse on a lot of places. I think header and footer are really a good example for experience fragments that we often see in AEM implementations. There are other benefits. So there's also really nice kind of reusability for experience fragments in sites, but not only in AEM sites, but also in other Adobe solutions like Target and Campaign. So key distinction, when we say content fragments, think about content without presentation. When we say experience fragments, think about both content and presentation together. And both can be reusable in different places, right? But the difference is like, do you want to reuse only the data or both the data and the presentation? And why does this difference, like, why is it so important? Because as I said, if you choose the wrong fragment type in the beginning, you will increase your complexity later. It will be much harder to switch. And you might have some governance, scalability, or maintainability issues later. So I think all of you who worked with CMS on, especially on enterprise level, know how like content design from the beginning of the project is a really, really, really important thing and important to get it right. So with that, I'll switch to sharing just quickly a couple of examples. By the way, these images are just ChatGPT generated based on some examples I've put in. So just to give you a little bit of idea, like when would it make sense to use content fragments in this specific case? So a very basic example is when you have contact information. So every company usually has a lot of contacts, whether it's like the leadership or the sales team, etc. That is reused in a lot of places. And then, especially if it's reused in different channels, it would make sense to create a content fragment, because you can reuse it in AEM. So, for example, on different pages, if you have an About Us page, if you have a leadership page, if you have Contact Us page, all of them can reuse the same content fragment. And then, of course, as I said before, a more important use case for content fragments is that you can use it also for other applications besides AEM that want to reuse this same content. In the second example, we have the experience fragment use case. And here you can see how one experience fragment can be reused for different purposes on different sites or different channels even. So you of course would use it in AEM, for example. In this example we have a hero, but you could use it in other channels, like for example email. So you can add also experience fragments and export them to the tool that you have in place for sending emails, or you can export them, for example, for Target. And the integration works quite nicely with experience fragments when you want to do personalization. And my last use case is like, does it make sense to combine them? And the obvious answer is yes, it very much makes sense to combine them, because content fragments can be used within experience fragments. And here is one example I came up with, but I'm sure there are many others. where, for example, you have a simple blog site where you have, of course, the editor page, and then next to the editor, you want to show the related articles that this editor has published. So we can create an experience fragment for that with the component showing the editor data and then the component fetching the related articles. And they can both use content fragments because author information is same as contact, right? A good candidate to store as a content fragment because it will probably be reused in a couple of places. And also articles can be stored as content fragments, especially if you want to reuse them outside of the website or with a different look and feel on the website itself. And this is one good example how you can have content fragments manage your structured data, but have experience fragments on top that control how you present that data on AEM sites. Yeah, and with that, I will stop like this presentation mode and jump into more Q&A style presentation. So I think I can stop my screen sharing now. Did I even share this or
Yeah, you were sharing.
I did? Okay, but did it stop now? I haven't pressed anything and I don't see I'm sharing anymore. So
Maybe AI agents are undercover working for you.
never know, never know. Okay, but as long as you don't see my presentation or your faces that I'm sharing, then we're good.
Yep.
Okay, so basically, yeah, I have prepared a couple of questions for you guys, Greg, Esteban. So whoever feels comfortable answering, just jump in.
Yep.
And then we'll see if we can also take some questions from the audience. I think that would be nice. Okay, so first question I've prepared is the following. So when we have teams that are adopting AEM for the first time, what are the most common mistakes that you've seen people when they design their content structure, when they need to decide between content fragments, experience fragments, or just AEM components? Like, what are some of the most common mistakes that you've seen on the projects that you worked on?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think the most common mistakes is run false assumptions, right? They just leverage, for example, you just mentioned that experience fragment, the most traditional use case, and even if you download the AM archetype, you have the header and footer set as experience fragment. So usually when you think on experience fragment, you think, oh, this is just the header and footer. That's one of the false assumptions. Another false assumption is when we talk about content fragments, since this has been lately mostly used for headless applications. We thought, oh, this is just headless related, so we don't need to use this on my site. So I think um, trying to step outside of that of those false assumptions is one of the biggest mistakes I've seen a lot of people just trying to follow patterns that sometimes are not necessarily patterns that will fit your organization, your project itself. Um, Another thing that I'll mention is most of the times there's a rush in coding and there's no proper information, architecture, and data structure properly defined. So people just start with this assumption of um, this is going to be reusable, and you forget that actually content fragments and experience fragments share this capability of being reusable. So you need to start digging a little bit more. It's not just reusable. The only thing you need to consider when you need to decide to choose either content fragments. But for example, what type of channels you will be using this content from for, like are you planning to use this into Adobe Target? Are you planning to show in Adobe Target the whole presentation of as an offer, or you just want to get the data as JSON and then pull more presentation on top of it? So I think those are, at least in my experience, the most frequent things that I see people rushing into decisions without proper analysis and just running. Um, I think just copy pasting patterns that don't necessarily fit to your organization. So yeah, no, you have any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, agreed. No, I mean, if to me, when before you sit down and decide content fragments versus experience fragments, think of your endpoints, think of your clientele, depending on the market you're in, and think about visual presentation. If it's a lot of visual presentation, motions, CTAs that offer different graphic enhancements to your content, that's mostly experience fragment. If it's more structured data, like what Daniel was showing, then you want to think of content fragments. And also, a main distinction for how at least we use it in our organization is GraphQL hybrid, or structured data that will decide whether you use content fragment, which is the case with GraphQL, most of the time, and then Adobe Target integration, like you mentioned, Esteban. It's like it's much easier to use experience fragments. You got an HTML exporter in the cloud space now. You have link rewriter too interface, so it works a little better with experience fragment. It's a little easier with your presentation.
All right, thank you very much. And Esteban, I have no idea what you were talking about, like pushing development and like doing it fast. Like I've never seen that. So, next question. How do you explain content versus presentation boundaries to your non-technical stakeholders, like editors, for example, or marketeers? Maybe this one is more for our more techie guy, Esteban.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a 3 years old kid, so I
Mm.
always try to do some analogies. So I think first you need to understand the difference. You made it pretty clear. But imagine you need to cook some meals, and then you have by one side you have the ingredients, like you have potatoes and chickens, but the meal itself, the dish is gonna look different, right? So with the same potatoes and chicken, you can do something like, I don't know, fried potatoes and I don't know, chicken nuggets, whatever. Or you could do mashed potatoes and roasted chicken, whatever. So the content itself are the ingredients. Those won't change. Those are simple raw data that you can put something around, so it's a final product, and that final product is essentially what you deliver with an experience fragment. So the boundaries, I think, will be defined if you, in this analogy of cooking, and sorry about that, it's almost lunch here. um, if you, for example, the potatoes are already cut or they have already salt, then the ingredients are not clean. You are somehow forced in some way to some final output. And I think in that regards, we need to think the content fragments shouldn't be adding extra presentations boundaries. So when you start consuming those content fragments, you can actually do whatever you need, whatever you want in there. So putting things like, for example, um, I don't know, in a content fragment, something like which type of colors you need to add here, or which type of layout, where these things should be um, positioned in the page. Those are kind of things that are out of boundaries, and you start mixing these concepts of clearing, splitting between just content versus presentation. Hopefully that makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
and sorry about the analogy.
It's a great analogy. Now I'm only sorry I haven't added potatoes and chicken on the slides, but I'll do that for the next time. But I think a great explanation, Esteban. Thank you very much. All right. So then I have a question for our Mr. PO, because I'm sure you talk to many stakeholders in your organization when you talk about like how to kind of design content structures. And when you talk to different stakeholders, like which signals do you hear from them that would kind of tell you, okay, this might be a good use case for an experience fragment or a content fragment?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good it's a good question, and it's always like going back to even before you get asked those questions, we want to have an idea of like um, where were you going to use your content fragments and experience fragments. So, again, we will be referring to this throughout this presentation. Does it need styling, layout? If yes, then experience fragment is preferable. um, Data forms, what are your property types? What is it? Structured data, content fragment, things like that. When they're talking about, when they mention, it's like the bio card you were showing with the image, the information of the author. This is structured data. You can use a content fragment. Are you going to be including other of your components? If somebody comes to me and says, yeah, we want to have this block here where it includes like a bio card, data list that has information about the person, footer, header, that's all experience fragment. That looks more involved. And again, you can have nested or included content fragments in your experience fragment, but those are bells for me that, okay, we should go a more involved way of presentation and everything. So is your goal visual composition, experience fragment right away? Are you working? Do you want a third party endpoints to consume GraphQL from your app, from your page? Yep, that's content fragment, easier. It depends. Those are generalization, of course, but the first things you look at is those kinds of signals, and then if reusability, headless content friendliness, all of that are weighing into the conversation between content fragments versus experience fragments. So yeah, it's a combination, and that's why when you mentioned it earlier, Daniel, like you got to sit down and think about your architecture, your content author's abilities as well, and how much of that, your governance, if you have an awesome content author team that's all like certified and they've been using AEM since the CQ5 days, like you have an easier job. But if it's, you know, a new team, or you're hiring um, a junior dev to do your content authoring, and then maybe not don't have any Java background or like any AM experience, then you want to, break that down for them and have them look into your overall architecture and your team, and letting them know what works best for your existing content and your clients on the other side.
Right. And now when I heard you talk, I came up with another follow-up question, which I'm happy any one of you take. So when we design content, right, it's really hard to know how that content will evolve over time. And we talk a lot about reusability, but the question is, you get one requirement, right, at a specific point of time, and you aren't really sure if this will ever be reusable in the future or not. So you need to make some best guesses, right, based on your experience, or consult a few other people in your organization, and then make a decision. What do you think? Is it better to, if you're unsure, is it better to do it as a fragment to have that option later for reusability, or to first do it as a plain component and then later refactor if you see other requirements for usability coming up? It's a tough one, I know.
This is pretty opinate question.
Yeah.
I'll go with the component, just because
Yep.
adding experience fragments can be overload. For example, when you need to consider that experience fragments are based on pages. So first you'll be using a template that will have extra JavaScript, that we have extra things that perhaps you won't necessarily need for a single use case. So I think it's pretty normal, and I think this is a regular use case that when you're working with technology, requirements change all the time. So I think keep it simple as much as you can. Um, if you see the component is easier, I will go with the component first, and then if I see reusability, then with more vision, I'll try to decide if this is going to be content fragment or experience fragment. Curious on your thoughts, Daniel, Greg.
Yeah, I agree, and I would say I tend to think of something like an experience fragment, for example, between uh, a page, a template with a page policy, and what components go into that page. Um, so your experience fragment goes between there and the component. So you have your component, experience fragments is in the middle, and then you have page policy uh, to think about. And it's if you're thinking that down the road you're going to need more logic is involved, things like that. That this always like you got to go with components. You don't want to overcomplicate your experience fragments because again, governance it's hard to maintain down the road if you're doing too many things with experience fragments, and maybe you have nested content fragments within the experience fragments. That's not very manageable. So always think component and logic in that kind of and let front end handle a lot of your kind of consumer interaction, your logins, all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think there was a really good comment there in the chat from Stephanie that there is also an option to convert to experience fragment later. Very good
Yeah.
point. Yeah, exactly. Uh, great, great. I see some questions coming up in the chat. I promise to leave some time to go through them as well, but I want to do a couple of these that I've prepared first. So next question I have is how early should teams start thinking about like the content or slash fragment strategy? And what are like the usual consequences if that decision is postponed? Like if we say, okay, let's do everything with components, like we don't have time for this, we'll do this later. Like what are the consequences of that decision? Is that a good, can it be a good thing or is it always a bad thing?
Yeah, I'll start, I guess. For me, always start early, but like your needs change. Your needs are gonna change, so that's fine. If you can pivot to from one to another, you can always create a new content fragment model and stop using content fragments that might not work for you, for example. So you don't have to author them, update them. Uh, but it's always better to have something planned ahead of time when you're creating a new content group, for example, like promotions or campaigns, or it's always better to sit down and figure that out first, and then think about content fragments versus experience fragments. Then start using one versus the other, and then having to reauthor or go back to backtrack or update a bunch of components that you're including maybe in one of those in the experience fragments, for example.
Yeah,
No.
I think sorry, I think you never start from scratch, right? You always at least have some wireframes, so you can have at least a first vision of how the site or how many sites you will be using. So I think that's a at least for the beginning a good enough information for you to start deciding, in creating this type of fragments. But as we were saying, right? I think when you just look briefly and you don't spend enough time to decide, this could be a fragment that could be problematic in very end for several reasons. Governance, one of them, also can be a performance issue in the very end. Um, Usually, I've seen sometimes you just ended up with a couple of content fragment models that nobody uses and just stay for longer time. So there's all type of situations that could be avoided if you just spend like short period of time trying to really define with what you have available at the time. Because as I said, Rian, you never really start from zero.
Yeah.
Someone really knows, how many pages, how many, we know about templates, so those are good information as
Mm.
well for to be a fit for these fragment definitions and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And maybe I would just add one more thing that I've seen happen a lot. So I think like fragments, reusability, like really makes sense in a lot of use cases. But we need to be also very considerate when we use them because they do add additional complexity, even though it seems like they are not, they are, because there are other features. And I saw some questions, for example, around translations, like publications, for example, as well. For example, if you want to clear your cache, for
Mm.
example, on CDN, each time you publish, think about content fragments and experience fragments. They sit on
Hmm.
a different page tree, not page tree, but tree in the CRX repository, which means that if you publish a page, like and then it uses data from like a content fragment or an experience fragment, you need to make sure that you also clear that cache, because that's going to be a separate file stored somewhere, in your cache layer. So it adds some complexity that is very easily kind of overlooked in the beginning if you haven't worked with data a lot before. And one other thing I would share as an advice is to really try to keep, for example, content fragments, like really use the out of the box stuff. I've seen a lot of examples where teams can go wild and start introducing a lot of custom things to content fragments, custom input fields, nested multi-fields,
Yeah.
a lot of those examples. And my experience is this at some point bites you in the ass, not in the first month, not maybe in the first year, but then a certain migration happens, you need to do certain things. Uh, it is really a really good strategy to stick to the out of the box fields when using content fragments. You most of the time can model everything with the out of the box stuff. You just need to get a little bit creative and not start customizing as like the first step.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Then next question. Do you guys have some best practices, rules, guardrails in place? How to keep fragment usage clean and scalable?
Yeah. I think I referred to this earlier. The content author teams and your structure, your folder structure within where the content authors use those fragments, they have to be aware of where they are, where they're stored, what the property, the fields are, the types, um, and they know how to use them, where to use them, what are the in the case of experience fragments, what are the relationship between nested fragments if they have content fragments, what other content fragments they're referencing, and all these factors. So that's primarily an issue of governance and knowing exactly what the nature of the component, what they're using. So your content authors need to be aware of that, and that happens again during the stage where you're maybe creating your content fragment model, and then you're deciding about what goes into those content fragment model fields and all that. So um, it takes it's an orchestration effort in the beginning, and then from that point on, it's easier. And like you said, Daniel, just keep it simple, especially with content fragments. Use the out of the box fields, and make it easier for you to handle that. Keep your folders clean, your structure, your architecture clean, and it gets easier as you use them.
I think governance is key because this becomes really critical items really quick. When you start using content fragments, it means you have the ability to break not only one channel but multiple channels at once. And when you start using things like Experience Fragment, it means you can also break several things at once. So governance is really important. It's really critical. So um, I think ownerships, ACLs are always things that needs to be mandated in this type of features. Things like defining clear naming conventions, defining the life cycles of these features, like, for example, when you should use an experience fragment variation, versus create a new fragment, when you should create a new version of the experience fragment, when should you delete a fragment or just unpublish. I think all of those tasks becomes critical and needs to be really understood by people who manage this. And at least I've seen, Greg, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not usually the same people that work with fragment that necessarily work with experience fragment. That's also becoming a tricky situation where you need to be aware of that. I personally, this is pretty open, sometimes pretty harsh, but I prefer to keep the content fragment models in the code base. So even if someone touches that, I
Yeah.
just override it, and that's kind of a hard rule, but at least I guarantee that that something won't change unexpected on the site.
Yeah,
So.
yeah. Having a workflow there is not a bad idea. Yeah, that for approvals. Also, like a tip from my experience is to have documentation on it, either in Confluence or whatever tool you're using, from Markdown to recording, like how they're used and everything. It creates kind of an onboarding experience for newer content authors if you're bringing them on your team, and for existing ones when something's updated, keep that documentation available, so you can prevent accidental breaking changes. Which channels those fragments are used in. You could do something like that. Have a now with AI agents with ChatGPT, for example, you can have a tree structure of your website and have that in your Confluence page and say, here's where these content fragments are used. So everyone is aware, basically, of that, of where they are.
Mhm. Definitely, definitely. Um, Three more things I want to briefly touch because they are really, really closely, I think, connected to the choices we make regarding fragments. We mentioned them a bit, but I want to hear your brief comment. First one, how do our fragment choices impact translation workflows and localization at scale?
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead. That's one.
No, go ahead, Greg. You
No,
can.
I was going to say it's critical when you have, your translation libraries, who's using them, where they're how they're updated. It's a key factor to consider. If you have a smaller site with less translations, it might not be a bad idea to use content fragments. But yeah, you're gonna need a lot more help and coordination and orchestration when you have like 30 languages in different parts of the world, and it gets more complicated.
I would maybe add, I think, like one very important step in the beginning is like when you design the content structures for content fragments, experience fragments, and sites, they need to match. So even though one starts with content, other one content/experience fragments, in the other one content down, the rest needs to match. You need to have the markets, the languages structured properly. That's like the first prerequisite for translation. And then later it also depends, like you need to really be careful when you choose your translation provider. Some of them, they use the translation connector, the out of box translation framework, which is good because it will pick up the references automatically, but a lot of them have custom connectors, and when they have custom connectors, you need to be very careful. You need to ask the vendors, hey, do you translate automatically all of my connected experience fragments and content fragments? Because I don't want every editor to pick the connected content in a custom UI screen, right? So I think those are some really important considerations when also choosing your translation provider. If you do it fully custom, I mean, the same thing applies, right? Let's say you build a custom connector, you need to think about from day one, hey, but I'm not translating only pages. I have content fragments stored in DAM. I have experience fragments stored in the experience fragments tree. So I need to think about those references. I need to get them included. Otherwise, your editors won't be very happy if they need to translate everything manually. Yeah, that's my 3 cents on that topic. And the next one, maybe for you, Esteban, is what performance or caching considerations should teams be aware of when deciding to use content fragments or experience fragments?
That's a great question. There's a big topic. There's a good discussion we can do. I'll try to put briefly. There's a lot of best practices that Adobe offers out of the box, like in the way you define your content fragments. When you start using things like how many levels of nesting you should be adding. You just need to be cautioned about how many content fragments you should be creating on your instance. How you design your query to be exposed via GraphQL. Um, all of these designs considerations are really important when you work with content fragments because I've seen sadly that sometimes content fragments are seen as kind of a mini database, and there's a lot of information. And AM, we just need to keep in mind, AM is just a CMS, it's not a BIM system, it's not a database, and there's a lot of things that can really hurt not only the way you deliver the content fragments, but the whole AM instance, and can really break your system. Even so, I'm gonna drop a link in chat later, uh, where there's a lot of things saying like things like add no more than X number of RTEs. Make sure you limit um, the amount of characters on the RTE and so on. But I think beyond that, you need to ensure that at least you use persistent queries, which are these store queries that become cacheable in different layers. You need to be aware that these persistent queries are not cached by default in the dispatcher, so you just need to do some configurations in dispatcher, ensure this is cached in your CDN as well. And of course, when you talk about cache, you need to consider also the flush strategy, ensure this is not randomly be flush, you have control over it. Ensure that you have optimized queries. The way you query is pretty important. The way you are filtering, the way you are sorting, use paginations, and so on. Because otherwise, you just load a lot of stuff that unfortunately is loaded in memory. So it's really, I don't want to say easy, but it's really possible that you break or your aim author or publish is becoming slower and slower. So you need to really be careful when you design um, uh, the content fragment models and the usage and the amount of them. So yeah.
Really good points, Esteban. I think we've all seen examples where content fragments have been used to add tens of thousands of, for example, products. And as you said, AEM is not a PIM. So just because you can store everything in AEM doesn't mean that you should. So especially in the modern architecture of AEM as a cloud service, Adobe also advises to use don't put everything in AM. I think this was
Mhm.
one of the main reasons for performance issues before cloud service. Like everything was put in AM. So these days we have usually connected services, different tools, cloud vendors where we can push custom microservices solutions, and that is definitely like the way to go from an architecture point of view. All right, so let's take a few questions from the audience. I think, Raf, we covered translation flows, so maybe we switch to your other question. Would content fragments work with connected assets, since they are not technically in the DAM folder? And if not, what would be a suggested workaround? I will tell you, Raf, I don't use connected assets. I have no idea. But my main guess would be that it doesn't work with content fragments because content fragments are not binaries. But I'll let Esteban or Greg add more details if they've worked with it.
Yeah, we're not using connected assets either. Yeah.
I think this idea of connected asset is that you have a separate DAM specific server, and then you just share the assets. So you need to think of what's going to be the purpose of the content fragments if you want to share in that way. Like if you just want to consume the information the content fragment has, then you don't really need connect assets, but you can just leverage the content via GraphQL or REST services. So you don't really need to use connected assets. But if you want somehow enable multiple authors to start touching your content fragments from a single location, as I still believe that you can just manage this via ACLs and proper permissions. And I don't know if that's a realistic use case that you want different users from different places or different organizations that touch your content fragments. So I I agree. I haven't used connected assets lately, but I agree with Daniel that this shouldn't work as far as I think. But I see the reason why this shouldn't work because I don't see the real use case of sharing the content fragments as this is data that can be updated everywhere.
Hope we covered that. We have a question from Andrea. For a multi-country, multi-language setup where the hero layout is maintained, but the content varies by country, is it better to model with content fragments or experience fragments and variants? Which pattern would you recommend? I'll just pretty quickly say that I wouldn't use either. I would just use a component with localization. But let me check if you agree, Esteban or Greg.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think it's as we discussed, right? Um, Keep it simple as much as you can. We are discussing this topic because this is great, but as Daniel already mentioned, there's a lot of um, extra things that you need to consider when you start adding these extra layers on top of it. So if you can keep it simple with a component, I think that will be the way to go.
Yeah.
Great that we agree on that. We have a question from a fellow champion. So Wilson is asking, are there restrictions or recommendations when using React framework to use content fragments on native mobile app? Not that I'm aware of. I mean, there are, as I said, GraphQL APIs. There are even like it's very, very simple to add REST APIs if that's what you prefer. I've also seen like teams like exposing like the whole site kind of tree as a REST API for the mobile apps, and I saw that working really well. So GraphQL is of course a more modern approach to it, but
Yeah,
no
that's
restrictions that I can think of.
yeah, designed for API consumers first. I mean, content fragments is the best approach there for React framework. That's the recommended approach.
I'll add something. Usually when you Google or you look in ChatGPT nowadays about React and AEM, you will see a lot of noise about SPA and some frameworks that Adobe put in place, which personally I don't think are needed. Those are just wrappers around how you can call the GraphQL directly. So I personally believe that you won't need any of those. So just keep it simple. Just think this as headless architecture. You just expose the APIs, whatever, as Daniel mentioned, whatever you need to via GraphQL or REST, and then you just consume the traditional way you will do in a React mobile app without extra wrappers on top of it. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah. Another great question from Raf. I really like this one. I'll also try to answer it right away because I've been looking into this topic a little bit lately. And it's regarding edge delivery services. So there are also fragments in edge delivery services. We're not focusing on that today. So we are focusing on like more classic AEM. And the question is, what differs between traditional AEM content fragments, experience fragments versus fragments in EDS? I haven't worked that much with EDS, to be honest, but I did look into this topic because I was also really curious, like when you do the migration, what do you do with fragments? And yes, there are fragments you can use in edge delivery services. But I found one thing that is makes a big difference. And if that hasn't changed recently, then the fragments in edge delivery services are client-side rendered, and this is a big thing to consider if you do the migration, because everything that's client-side rendered, has a big impact on SEO and connected topics. So it doesn't work exactly one-on-one as it did work with classic AEM. So if you are doing that migration, just make sure, to really do proper preparation and planning how to actually move that content over, because if you are moving to EDS, I mean, you want the server-side rendering and you want the speed, right? So there are some challenges there. Maybe Esteban, you had more experience?
Not really, but something I'll add is that also you in EDS you kind of lose this ability to expose directly fragments. Like you have these chunks of pages essentially, which are in different locations that can be embedded into different documents and so on. But those are not really something that you can expose via JSON or HTML in the way experience fragments or content fragments can. So that's another consideration that I'll take on mind if you are moving or migrating to EDS. So I see that's a lack still on EDS, that you can produce JSONs via some spreadsheets, I guess, in document base, or if you're using Universal Editor via the traditional um, Java APIs. But in document base, I still don't see that there's a way that you can expose directly via headless some of your those fragments. So I think that's hopefully something that will be addressed future.
Well, like if you use like EDS with AEM author, you can
Mhm.
still use content fragments. The
Right.
thing is, you will fetch the data via an API in EDS, and they're going to be client-side rendered. So you can still use like the classic content fragments, but the rendering part works quite differently. It's not server-side anymore, and that's, I think, a big difference. There are also like we need to distinguish the content fragments from classic AEM from EDS fragments. So these are
Yep.
two different things. Um, we'll take two more questions, and then I think we're out of time anyway. There is a question from Artem. In case of AEM Universal Editor, is there other logic around what to use, content fragments versus experience fragments? And I would say the choice of editor should not have and should not have any difference. I think Universal Editor has a feature that you can edit content of content fragments and experience fragments directly on the site, which is a nice feature. Can also maybe cause some problems from an editor perspective. Greg, I'm not sure if you agree with that. I haven't really worked with it.
On the in-page edit, yeah, I mean the changes persist if you're using Universal Editor, it will change. But yeah, that's another case where you might, if there's a larger content authoring team, might want to have a workflow, something that will alert folks of what's changed. Um, but yeah, there's not more that I know of on with regards to logic itself. As far as like content authors are concerned.
All right, and we'll take the final question from Jay. When using AEM content fragments as a headless CMS and exposing data to other platforms via GraphQL, how can security and authentication be maintained at the GraphQL level? I think that's an interesting question, because I never really thought about it that way, because like usually when you have content fragments and you have AEM sites, that is usually in 90% of use cases, that is public data. You don't need authentication for, and you don't need any security, because it's the data you display publicly on your website. And why not then expose it as an open API as well, just in a different format, so JSON instead of HTML, for example. And I'm not a huge fan, to be honest, of GraphQL. So I'll let Esteban answer this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I agree with you, Daniel. You can think of content fragments are essentially assets. So you really it's few cases where you have to put some security on top of assets. This will be asset that will be published on your publish instance. But if you really want your need to put some security on top of this, I think you just need to leverage the traditional Java available methods that you have on AEM. Like if you want to implement OAuth 2, or even if you have to put a dummy, user and password basic authentication on top of it, then you can do it and bypass. Don't call directly the GraphQL. There's a lot of things that can be done through the dispatcher and Java itself. So I will look into those. I don't think there's anything out of the box for GraphQL security. So I think we are um, stepping on the customization field here.
All right, and we are out of time. So thanks everyone for the great questions. So it's been really a good discussion, and it's always fun to bring like your questions on the table to make this a little bit more dynamic discussion. Thank you very much, Esteban and Greg, for being our experts today and covering all that content. I think it's been a great session, not because I was hosting it. And yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to follow-up sessions on other topics. So guys, stay tuned. There will be a lot more cool topics to discuss. So stay tuned for our next session in February. Thank you, and we'll see you around. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.